right, we'd like, good afternoon again. So if everyone could kind of come in and take your seats so we can get started with our last panel before we have the conversation with Professor Burnham and Chancellor Nobles. So I know that the discussion has been very rich, and this is one more layer before we get the icing on this event. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much, Dr. Jackson. Hello, folks. Good afternoon. My name is Melvin Kelley. I'm an instructor here at Northeastern University. I hold a dual appointment with the School of Law and the DeMoore McKim School of Business, and it's also my honor to serve as a member of the advisory board for the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project. I'm actually not going to say too much either about myself or offer the full extent of the range of accomplishments and achievements that our distinguished panelists bring to the table, in part because we have such a notable embarrassment of riches that we need to sort of just kind of dive right in here and get to it. But that being said, I did want to sort of offer at least a couple of thoughts. And again, as each of our panelists takes a turn, I'll offer a few sort of lines about their contributions and where that's situated with respect to our dialogue today. But as the overview or sort of overarching kind of perspective on where we are in this dialogue and this conversation, that is also a member of our distinguished panel, and so we're going to make sure that their contributions are heard as well. Professor Jackson, so family. Okay, so on this front, though, the conversation that unfolded just a moment ago with our families who are the direct descendants of the victims in terms of the cases that we've been able to investigate and are now a part of the Burnham-Nobles Archive. That conversation, began to unearth the ways in which the trauma and the harms and the repair reverberates across time, right? And so our panel conversation, Historical Violence, Contemporary Inequality, and Future Advocacy, sort of builds off of those observations. And indeed, one of the conduits is that we saw sort of the ways in which there were patterns and practices that seemed to resurface as the tellings and each of these cases and those details unfolded. And indeed, what some of the observations was that was stemming from the way in which this wasn't a story about individual actors, and was a question in a situation that was emblematic of a system, right? And so institutional perspective that was being brought to bear, and thinking about the ways that the criminal justice system writ large was implicated, right? And so even when law enforcement officers weren't directly involved in some of the racially motivated killings, we know that the impunity that was afforded to the perpetrators thereafter would not have been possible if not for the tacit approval of those law enforcement officers and other entities and officials who were charged with tasking and enforcing these crimes, right? And so from that perspective, that invites us to think about the role of the criminal justice system, both historically and in the present, as a system of effectuating racialized control, right? And what I do want to say on that front is that the project has already done some work in this regard in thinking about how our cases speak to that ongoing structural implication of historical racial violence. And there are many mediums through which this past shows up in the present. And so I mentioned this just to sort of say, CRRJ has already begun doing some of that work in our Historical Injustice Present Policing program, which thinks about the ways that we can use the cases in the archive to inform police practices moving forward in the hopes of addressing ongoing remnants of violence as manifested in police brutality and mass incarceration and racial profiling, right? And so our distinguished panelists today are going to offer insights and perspectives from their various disciplines to help us continue to think about the ways in which the case studies that we've been able to compile are hopefully able to be mobilized for additional insights, for scholarship, and for activism informing our policies and practices moving forward. And so without further ado, I'm going to invite Professor Christine Simcoe to start us off. who is a professor in the Anthropology and Sociology Department at Williams. Her work examines individual and collective memory of the past to ascertain prospects, or at least one strand for our purposes, to ascertain prospects for bridging mnemonic cleavages between Black and white Americans concerning their respective group recollection of historical racial violence and its contemporary significance. So please welcome Professor Christine Simcoe.
Always need to tip the microphone down a little bit. I see some fellow travelers in the audience. It is just the deepest kind of honor to be here and to have the opportunity to speak to you today, to speak with you today. When he set the charge for this panel, Professor Kelley asked us to consider what the Burnham-Nobles Archive will contribute to future scholarly inquiries and activist projects. Right, so sort of distilling the panel into one sentence. And as I mulled over my many answers to this question, and I have many, many more than I could fit into 10 minutes, but I'll spare you that. I found it really helpful, and now it's going to be really clear we're making a transition to the scholars panel, and I apologize for that. I found it really helpful to return to conceptual discussions of the archive in general. So what work do archives do in general, especially from a social justice perspective? And so for me, and my professional identity is both as a sociologist and as a person who's deeply invested in the interdisciplinary and international field of memory studies. One of the most helpful discussions of the archive, at least for the purposes that I'm going to speak about it today, comes from a German literary scholar named Elida Assmann from a piece called Archive and Canon. So Assmann's understanding of the archive grows out of a paradox that I think is relevant to the work that all of us in the room are engaged in one way or another. That is harnessing memory to promote justice. So stated as simply as possible, the paradox, and I'm really going to distill it into 3 words, is that memory necessitates forgetting, right? Memory always necessitates forgetting. And we all, I think, know that this is true at an individual level. So all of us have been surprised at how quickly we can forget meals we've eaten, outfits we've worn, and even important details from conversations we've had with colleagues about, the future of a case or the future of our department. Fill in the gap as may be relevant to you. We simply don't have the cognitive capacity to remember most of what we do and say, right? So mundane details get squeezed out constantly to create space for things that are most important or in some way most enduring. Again, without forgetting, we'd be totally mired in detail and unable to construct a coherent and meaningful account of the past. So again, memory necessitates forgetting, paradoxically. And so often, individual practices like journaling or photography are motivated, at least in part, by a recognition of how little we're actually able to remember or retain over time. So we use these, what scholars call technologies of memory outside the brain to preserve a little bit more from the past. And so we can look back, we can revisit the details, and even revise our sense of who we are in the present in light of the records available to us that we created in the past. And, I think that archives play a similar role, a parallel role at the level of society and culture. So at a collective level, too, memory necessitates forgetting. We can't tell a story about ourselves as a group, about who we are, about where we've been, about where we're going, without omitting some, and I would say even most, of the intricate details. But the archive is really fantastic because it mediates between what we actively remember, what Assmann calls the canon of memory, and what is forgotten altogether, what passes into oblivion and can't be reincorporated, right? So the archive is that space between the stories we tell in museums, right? In the National Museum of American History that we thought about earlier today, right? In high school history classes and textbooks, in political speeches. And by preserving the stories that aren't canonized, or I really should say aren't yet canonized, I think that's an important distinction, archives make it possible for us to revise the canons of memory. to rework the stories of who we are, where we've been, and where we're going in light of evidence preserved from the past. And so Osman, in true scholarly passion, puts it this way: the archive is the basis of what can be said in the future about the present when it will have become the past, right? So that's a lot. The archive is the basis of what can be said in the future, right? It gives us a foundation for the stories that we will be able to tell. And when I read Professor Burnham's book, By Hands Now Known, I hear a powerful call to reconstruct the stories that we tell about the US past, one that more clearly reflects and mournfully addresses the experiences of Americans like Ollie Hunter, whose story opens the book, and the experiences of the Americans whose stories we just heard about so movingly on the last panel. And so the Burnham-Nobles Archive bequeaths to our future a critical set of resources for reflecting more truthfully about the US past. And it comes to us at a crucial moment when a lot of the direct witnesses to the history that it documents are increasingly passing from the scene. And so now I want to turn to this question that pertains more specifically to the work that I do on national narratives, national storytelling. How might the Burnham-Nobles Archive help transform canonical national narratives? And to answer this question, I need to dip back briefly just one more time into the so-called memory studies literature, but again, I'll try to distill things really briefly. So if I were to sum up the most central finding from the sociology of collective memory in just a few words, here's how I would put it. And again, I've got a 3-word phrase. Memory operates dialogically. And what I mean by that is that the stories that we tell about the past are always in motion, they're always subject to change, they're always involved in change, but when we seek to transform them, we always have to do so in dialogue with previous narratives. So for those of you who are attorneys, and this idea also was brought up in the last panel, I think there's a strong parallel with the way that precedent operates in law. It's not that things never change, but there is an intrinsic bias toward stability. And I think on the last panel, it became really clear how that intrinsic bias plays out, right, when you have precedent that is rooted in white, male, wealthy experience. So in my own ongoing research on national memory in the United States, I've seen how projects that share similar goals with the Burnham-Nobles Archive draw on meticulously collected historical materials to creatively revise through those dialogues and even transform national narratives. And of course, I want to say that none of these projects are perfect or complete. They don't address all 4 of the components of reparative justice that Professor Burnham rightfully highlights in By Hands Now Known. But I think they do crucial work that opens pathways toward justice. So in my last couple of minutes, I want to share a few slides that briefly showcase how some of these new projects engage with dominant national narratives. And I will look specifically at narratives of freedom, democracy, and terrorism in potentially transformative ways. So I'll start with the idea of freedom. I imagine that virtually everyone here is familiar with the work of the Equal Justice Initiative and their National Memorial for Peace and Justice and Companion Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. And this is a space where I've spent a lot of time thinking about national memory and its future. So the memorial deals most centrally with the history of lynching, but also situates lynching within the larger history of race and racial violence in the United States. And there are a lot of ways that EJI engages dialogically with national narratives, but for now, I want to highlight just one, and that is the idea of freedom. So at the EJI Memorial, there is, in many ways, maintenance of a narrative whereby freedom is the ultimate value pursued in the United States as a nation. But freedom is clearly understood as a future aspiration rather than a past or present state of being, even for white Americans. So as EJI founder and executive director Brian Stevenson puts it, I think the history of racial violence has done real psychic damage, not just to Black people, but to white people too. I don't even think that white people in our country are free. I think we're all burdened by this history. Of course, Stevenson's understanding of freedom is not new. I hear echoes of Fannie Lou Hamer, among many others. But the symbolic draw of the memorial has, I think, amplified EJI's work in ways that are potentially transformative, bridging deep and longstanding cleavages between white Americans and Black Americans, or at least endeavoring to do so, in how we understand the nation's past and our role in it, and how we work to shape its future. Another example pertains to the idea of democracy. In the opening essay of the 1619 project, Nicole Hannah-Jones puzzles over her father's decision to fly the American flag in her family's front yard during her childhood. And she comes to understand her father's patriotism only when she retells the story of US democracy with Black Americans as its primary protagonists and heroes. So in the US she recognizes would not exist without Black Americans, and from one generation to the next, Black Americans have been, as she puts it, the perfecters of this democracy. So by the end of the essay, Hannah-Jones concludes that Black citizens are, quote, the most American of all. And then finally, and lastly, on a slightly different note, just a quick word about how activists, including many of the people who have spoken from this microphone today, have used the language of terrorism to change our understanding of racial violence. And I think that this is a particularly profound turning point or shift. So in the era after the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, and especially the events of September 11th, 2001, terrorism became this really potent symbolic framework. It became the ultimate emblem of evil. If you really want to denounce somebody or denounce an act of violence, you call them a terrorist or you call the violence terroristic. And you know, I also want to acknowledge, right, racial justice activists from Ida B. Wells to the present have long pointed out that there was and is a much deeper history of terroristic violence in the United States. But the meanings of the term in national discourse, broadly speaking, have shifted in the last few decades. We see this narrative again in Professor Burnham's book and at the EJI Memorial, and again in many of the talks today. But I want to highlight one more recent institution where it plays a central role, and that is the Greenwood Rising Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which opened in 2021. So Greenwood Rising is the most recent product of local activism to gain recognition for the horrific violence that took place in Tulsa in 1921. In the museum, the panel explaining the Tulsa race massacre reads in part, "Centuries of racist policies toward Black Americans fueled attacks on Black communities across the country. On May 31st, 1921, these forces of oppression culminated in one of the worst acts of domestic terrorism in our nation's history." So again, in today's cultural climate, terrorism demands a tangible moral, emotional, and political, perhaps even legal response. So I've become particularly interested in watching whether this narrative will bring about material change as well as symbolic change. So now that it's open for public use, the Burnham-Nobles Archive enters all of these dialogues. It speaks to the meanings of freedom, of democracy, and of terrorism. It will become the source material for new museum panels, new essays with a national readership, and new speeches by political activists and advocates. It prevents crucial human stories and national truths from slipping into oblivion with the passing of generations. It shows us what allied projects, and I think this is really important and a really important reason to read those essays that we were shown in the earlier tour of the archive. Read those essays because it shows us what allied projects miss when they insist on rigid definitions of lynching as a filter for what we archive, what we record, what we acknowledge. Because it shows us that we miss, when we insist on those definitions, stories like Ollie Hunter's, stories that we must preserve if we are to understand the reality of the Jim Crow era and its legacies in the present. So thank you so much for having me here today, but more than that, thank you for giving us an archive that so vastly expands what can be said about the past in the future.
So, folks, I'd be remiss if I didn't know that you could get some additional information about each of our panelists by using this scanned QR code. For those of you who aren't familiar, that this is an option. So please do, and quick shout out to the people behind the scenes who made sure that we had thoughtfully curated bios and extensive bios for your review and consideration. Really worth checking out some of the additional scholarship and contributions that these folks have put on the table. But again, we will keep going, and we will have hopefully some time at the end to have a collective Q&A. Next up, we will hear from Professor Inga Laurent, who's a professor of law at Gonzaga University School of Law. She's working on a book project that compares international transjustice processes to mine insights for best practices. This endeavor is also considering how historical information, such as that has been archived, can be used as a database. For those of us who approach this work from a legal perspective, we often think about the ways in which legislative history is useful to construe sort of the purpose of legislation and how that should apply to certain situations and provide the basis for remedies. And Professor Laurent's work is beginning to consider that as well. One of the things that I do want to say about the comparative transitional justice work that looks at truth and reconciliation commissions is that one of the reasons that CRRJ exists in terms of this archiving endeavor, and indeed as some of the panelists kind of mentioned, there is no other apparatus that's collecting these histories. And so in that vacuum, CRRJ is in itself taking up the helm of doing the work that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission might actually do. And so in that regard, I think it makes some sense for us to hear about some practices and how that might inform some of the contours of our work moving forward. So thank you, and please welcome Professor Laurent.
Warm, really warm greetings and gratitude to everybody in this room. If we are a composite of what we spend our time and attention on, then in this room I feel that America is in good hands. And that's you all in this audience taking the time to be here, to give your attention to these matters, to learn. So I just feel extremely honored to be here today. Also, to acknowledge the complexities of what we're discussing. You've seen it, right? There's pain, there's suffering. I've shed tears today, many tears today, and there is joy. Right? There is resilience and there is beauty. Our stories are complex, and it's important, it's extremely important to acknowledge the complexities of stories and nuance, and that's how I really end up in the world where I sit at learning about restorative justice, the theories that underlie restorative justice, and as an offshoot of restorative justice theory, also learning about international truth and reconciliation commissions that have existed over time. So my love of restorative justice led me here because honestly, I can say we're starting to see more and more interest, right? We're seeing truth and reconciliation commissions proliferate. We've had about 35 of them globally, and in the United States, we're starting to see them pop up more frequently in states, in local townships and municipalities doing work on these, and there's a lot of talk on the horizon, right, that we will have a national Truth and Reconciliation Commission at some point in the United States. And that brings me great joy and great trepidation. And so that's where my work sits. That's a lot of what I hope to do with probably the rest of my life, I assume, is to look at Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, do a little bit of comparative work internationally, look at what's happened, pay attention to the lessons that we can learn, the shoulders of the giants that we stand on, who put forward Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and where we can draw the strengths and where we need to have critical assessment of those processes. So that's really how I come to this work. And so I'd love to share super briefly. This is definitely the scholar panel. I was like, how am I even gonna, I don't know, how am I gonna distill truth and reconciliation? We're gonna try, and we'll get through as much as we get through. You have permission, of course, cut me off at my 10 minutes. I wanna share with everybody. This is the path that I would like to follow today. I think language is very important, so I obviously chose not to use the word agenda, but I think it's a journey that we're going to go on together. I'd like to talk about the discursive limitations, all those that come from the dangers of what I'll call temporal, categorical, and colonial framing. I'll explain and give examples for all of that. Then I'd like to talk about some potential reparative and restorative tools that can interrupt these things. And also I'd like to talk about the importance of, again, language and reclaiming the words, because restorative justice has been with us since for time immemorial, right? We are reclaiming the concepts of restorative justice, but these concepts are old. And in fact, they carried us through most of human history. It's only relatively recently, Middle Ages, right, that we started working with more retributive forms of justice. So we innately know how to do this work. And all of our ancestors are really calling us back to this type of work, to this type of communion and community and being in communion and community with one another, and finding out what the real definition of accountability means. So that's an ambitious journey or an ambitious path, but we'll try and walk it. Okay. So the discursive limitations that I want to talk about, that's fancy language, so I'm going to, get to the real of it in a minute here. But I call them dangers of what I've termed as temporal, categorical, and colonial framing in truth collection processes. So if a truth collection truth and reconciliation process or any truth collection work goes forward in the US or any place really, these are some of the things we should be aware of. So the first is the temporal framing. So as I was listening to Professor Burnham's interview with Dave Davies on NPR, I cringed at a moment when he says, these crimes are decades old, right? The implication in that sentence, right, is that convince me why I should be concerned about this. And I got really exhausted just from the question. So I listened and tried to learn and put myself in a mentorship position to figure out how someone answers that continually over a lifetime with grace. Because I'm getting tired of answering it. We had the living examples up here on stage to tell us, and I cried through almost the whole thing. Historical and past injustice are misnomers. They do not exist. The violence that happens and the fracturing that happens in people's lives from those violent incidents, both individual violence and systemic violence that allows that dehumanization to occur, continues and reaches out for multiple generations, right? Economically, with psychological health and consequences, trauma that lives physically now, the science is finding out in our bodies, our physical beings are impacted. And so when people try to frame these issues as historical or as past, they also frame our capacity for possibilities to actually address the wrongs, because the wrongs are compressed and the complexity is reduced to quote unquote lynching, instead of the Great Migration, instead of the loss of generational wealth, and instead of the loss of a family, the breaking up of the structure of the soul of the people of who we are. How do you account for that, right? And if you frame things as historical injustice, that means that it was and no longer is happening. And so we have to be very careful about our language around how we talk about these things. So like I said, I'll give you the problems, and then I'll give you some potential tools and interventions or different language to think about in the future. Also, and then just on a note, in TRCs, we do this naturally because we define things by time frame. So you can only put forward your claim and your testimony between the years of killings or things that were categorically like said, okay, we'll talk about killings, we'll talk about torture from, for instance, in Argentina, 1973 to 1986. So there's a physical limitation on the time frame that is permissible for you to bring claims. So we have to be very careful with that if we're talking about truth and reconciliation processes going forward. The second limitation is categorical limitation. And this one, I'm just gonna give you an example because it's the best way to sort of like get right in there. But I'll just sort of frame it broadly. The frame defines the problem rather than the problem defining the frame. So in South Africa, for instance, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission there decided what were going to be cognizable claims, what was going to be permissible for folks to give testimony about and to bring forward on these claims. So we already know the claims are based on a time period. Now we have further fracturing of what's allowed, right? So killings and torture and things of that nature were surely going to come onto that list, obviously. But the decisions were made that the focus would be on violations of what they called bodily integrity rights, okay? And so arson originally was not on the list, okay? Because they looked at arson and they thought, well, that's more about substance rights claims rather than bodily integrity claims. Well, thank the women. Because in South Africa, the woman said, no. Arson needs to go on that list, and let us tell you why. It's a systematic, deliberate tool that devastates an entire area. It's a complex scheme of mass-scale family and community and psychological destabilization. Right? So they advocated, and so this is a great example of advocacy groups, right? Getting in there and doing their thing and saying, we don't agree with your definitions and your limitations. Let us tell you why you need to widen those categorical frames, right? And so that is another instance of a problem that can arise when we have hyper-limited frames, historical or categorical frames. And the last, and I would be very remiss if I also didn't say this. That kind of limitation also really is disjunctive for victim survivors who are trying to tell their stories, because it cuts off your ability to tell your entire truth, right? We're taking and we're selecting pieces of the story that fit our narrative, the narrative that we've defined is a cognizable claim, and and cutting up your ability to tell your whole story. So that's also very dangerous, and the studies are showing us, like, psychologically, that is not a healthy way for someone to recount their truth and to try and begin healing from the traumas that occur if they have to carve up pieces of their story and they can't tell the story the way they need to as they experienced it, right? So also very dangerous. And finally, colonial framing. So Indigenous scholar Taiyake Alfred really sums this up, hits the nail right on the head. I don't have to say much beyond it. What good is reconciliation if Indigenous people are reconciling themselves to colonialism? Okay? So it's really important that when we think about truth and reconciliation commissions, that we think about who's asking and why. Oftentimes, TRCs, while yes, and they're wonderful. I also, I'm sounding very critical of TRCs. I believe in them, but I believe they can be better, okay? So I do want to start from that premise. But TRCs are often formed, right, in conjunction with the governments that ultimately sort of are the winners, right, or the ones that are currently in power right now. And so what that can lead to is a reifying of state legitimacy, right? The government is sort of participating in this process, allowing this process to go forward, and they can start to push the narrative into reconciliation narratives. because now this government is in power, and this government needs to ensure, right, a transition to a stable, new future for everyone. And so it can sound a lot, right, like this is going to be healing for us as a country. This process is meant to heal us, right? This process is meant to move us past the trauma. And that's potentially dangerous, right? Yes, we do want stable democracies, especially in when we're talking about transitional justice, right? And these TRCs getting set up in situations that are really quite heinous and awful. And this provides some level of accountability for folks. But it's also something we need to be wary of if the central goal is government and political legitimacy at the expense of victim-centered survivor advocacy, and that being our driving goal. So also just something to sort of worry about. I think I'm getting close to time, so I'm just going to very quickly talk about a few reparative and restorative tools that can interrupt these. And the great thing about this stuff is this is pulled from everywhere. So it's super interdisciplinary. It's super responsive to psychology and what they're finding about truth telling. And they're finding both, right, benefits and drawbacks. It also tries to really tune into what's going on the ground, what activists are talking about. You know, Tricia Hersey, rest is resistance, somatic abolitionism, right? So it's trying to say, people have been doing this work forever. People have been resisting colonialism forever. Go to those people, go to those communities, find the leaders, find them and what they're doing, let them tell their stories, let them tell their stories to you in the ways that are meaningful to them, learn from them, resource them, and then maybe we can talk reconciliation, right? So just for temporal, we're lots of scholars, this is not just me, propose different language. We're not talking about historic or past injustice. We're talking about just injustice that is still living. It's physically in us, right? This is historically present injustice, okay? So it's this idea that justice fractures and continues on until meaningful reconciliation and accountability actually has a chance to operationalize and to heal. For categorical framing, we have to open the space to allow for what I quote unquote call inconvenient narratives, right? Narratives that don't fit the categorical frame exactly as you have designated them, right? We have to allow this space for victims and survivors to be able to tell their stories in the way that's meaningful to them, and we also have to give them the agency not to, right? And this is, I think, what I admire so much about the work that's been done, that we're all supporting in this room, but the dignity of the person comes through so clearly in the work that's being done, and that's what we should use as a model for this, the categorical framing. We never force people into this scenario or present it to them like, oh, it will heal you, or tell them what the outcome will be. We provide and give people process, and we say, here's what we would like to offer you. Now you make a meaningful and informed choice about when, if, whether you want to come to us or this work or engage with us in this way. And that is really, really important. And TRCs often, I think, frame things because they have such a positive idea of themselves. And I don't want to take that away, but we don't control the outcomes. You see a lot of the recommendations from Truth and Reconciliation commissions never get off the ground, right? They sit on the shelf. We don't control the outcome. So to promise somebody that it will be healing, or that we're going to put these recommendations out there and they're going to get picked up, we have no control over outcome. Only thing we can do is control process. And that's why that last step is really important. We have to let people tell their stories, and the stories have to include uplifting, positive, resilient narratives, right? It's so important because, I'm sorry, I'm like getting, thank you, one more minute. we have to allow those narratives, because again, we're more than being stuck and frozen in a victim story. And I'm really tired of being in rooms when people are talking about truth and reconciliation commissions, and I feel worse when I leave there, because I feel like I've been talked about. I don't feel like I've been included in the conversation. I don't feel like my recognition of my truth is being experienced in that room. I feel like it can be a savior narrative, right? And so we need to acknowledge, Jonique, Sheila, and Evan, right? That is resilience in action. That is your family's, you are your family's legacy, right? And that has to be acknowledged, and that's beautiful. And it is an awful story, but beauty comes from that, and we must acknowledge that too. So I'm just gonna leave it there, because there's nothing more important to say than that, so.
Thank you so much, Professor Laurent. We appreciate the observations you were able to share in our allotted time. We'll keep moving at the moment, again, and make sure our panelists do have a chance to share some of their work and some of their insights. So next we'll hear from Professor Francis, who's a professor of economics at UMass Boston. She's written on the economics of reparations and conducted studies pertaining to quantifying the loss of wealth stemming from policies and practices, including violence, that resulted in the agricultural land loss for African Americans. So, Professor Francis, please.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Kelley. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to share my research and really engage in these important conversations. I have deep admiration for the work of Professor Burnham and the CRRJ and in these areas of restorative justice and really accounting and producing an accounting of the racial violence in the U.S. I am deeply appreciative of the panel before us and sharing your stories and the stories of your loved ones. Thank you for that. So I'll jump right in. I come to this work through my interest in reparations, reparations for Black Americans, and in particular, the economics of reparations. My training is as an economist. And as part of that research agenda, I've been interested in putting a dollar value on some of the state-sanctioned atrocities faced by Black Americans. And so one way I've sought to do that is through estimating the value of agricultural land loss to Black Americans over the course of the 20th century. I'm going to assume, yes, excellent. Land ownership has really been a path to prosperity for many families in the U.S. And in an historic study of a rural county in Alabama, the sociologist Charles Johnson found that farm owners had larger, better quality homes, more equipment and livestock, kept their kids in school longer, grew more food for themselves, and had more magazine subscriptions, right, a sign of wealth at the time, than non-farm owners. Other writers found similar results in North Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, and elsewhere in the South. And so I don't have to do too much more work or say much more about how wealth and ownership creates opportunity and more wealth, because I think the conference thus far has done an excellent job of demonstrating that. So, at the end of the Civil War, Black families owned almost no land, right? But they demonstrated an almost universal desire to obtain it. African Americans soon acquired acreage at a rapid pace. Du Bois estimated that Black families owned 3 million acres in 1875, 8 million in 1890, and 12 million in 1900. And by 1910, African Americans acquired more than 16 million acres. And according to the late historian Manning Marable, this would be the largest amount of property they would ever own within the United States. Black farmers had acquired this land against a backdrop of extreme racial violence, oftentimes directed at landowners. White planters conspired together to restrict land sales to African Americans. Because many banks refused to lend to African Americans, they had limited credit resources when the Great Depression hit. And even though the federal government enacted massive spending programs to halt the farm crisis of the Great Depression era, the insistence by Southern politicians that these programs be administered at the local level effectively blocked black farmers from receiving relief. Right? So in addition to controlling government benefits, white Southern elites found other ways to take black farmers' land. In one instance, a bank, a crop duster company, and federal officials conspired to force a reverend into debt and out of his land. Another common tactic was for a federal agent to delay a loan to a black farmer, which would cause the farmer to plant late, which means they would reap a smaller harvest, which means they'd end up in debt, right? So all available evidence suggests that schemes like these were widespread. Black farmers made a direct attack on this system in the 1960s when they worked with civil rights organizers to run election campaigns to integrate USDA county committees. White elites, however, used threats of job loss to repel voters and even resorted to blatant election fraud with no consequences. A series of federal studies, along with numerous investigative reports, have found that the USDA agents continued to discriminate against black farmers after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the USDA has never investigated civil rights complaints in a systematic way. Okay? So many landowners have also lost their property through racial violence. Under the threat of lynching or in the aftermath of a lynching, black landowners have fled their properties and been forced to sell their land for pennies on the dollar, usually to the benefit of white landowners. Sheila Moss Brown shared with us the 111 acres owned by her grandfather, Mr. Gilbert, as an example of this, right? So thank you for sharing. So I have been working with an amazing team of researchers on estimating the value of black land loss from 1920 to 1997. This paper was published in the AEA Papers and Proceedings in May of this year and is available. And I'll just briefly go through some of our results. So we use county level data on acreage and land values from the US Census of Agriculture. They're available in roughly 5-year increments since 1920. We supplement this with the Census of Agriculture files in the ICPSR data repository. And we focus on 17 states, really the 17 states where virtually all black landowners own their land. Let's see. And this is an example of what one of the Census of Agriculture schedules might look like, where you can pull out acreage values from the PDFs. What do we focus on? We focus on, there's a lot of nuance in defining, right, like what is ownership, who owns land, do you have part ownership, are you an operator, if you own the whole land but rent some of it out, right, there's a lot of these nuances, and so we did our due diligence in making sure that we understood historically what the Census of Agriculture was collecting and what that means, and we produced estimates that are based on sort of robust definitions of what ownership meant at the time. So I'll just say that point. And so here's an example of the decline in black-owned acreage over this time period. Huge, right? I mean, precipitous, right? Like starting from the almost 16 million to close to zero, right? In this modern time. And this is the case whether we, regardless of what definition of part ownership, full ownership we use. What else do I want to say? Okay, so the other thing that we have to think about, I'll also mention that there's lots of variation across these states over time. These 17 states didn't have the same amount of land loss, but let's see if, sorry, give me just a second. The graphic's not working, but that's okay. But that there are varying degrees over time as well. Okay. So then the other consideration we think about are what are the land loss values, the dollar values that the land was worth, right? There's the acreage, and then there's the dollar values that this land was worth. And the good thing about the county level data that we're able to use is that we can get county level land values. Instead of having to use some sort of national average of land values, we can get county level values. And this is important because, right, like, soil in the Mississippi Delta, right, would have been worth a lot more than in some other places, right? So we're able to really get that fine-grained detail. I am not going to bore you with some of this detail, but we also did a lot of due diligence in thinking about what are the land value numbers that we should use, and really our goal in this estimate was, let's choose the most conservative estimate we can, right? Let's use lower land values so nobody can come and say, right, like you've pumped up the values in order to get some big numbers. So we tried to do our best to make decisions that made this estimate very conservative. Okay. So what do? We take this information that we have, right? We have acreage value, we have the acreage, we have the value of that acreage over time, and we calculate yearly land loss values, right? And we accumulate that land loss and compound it over time using a reasonable rate of return for that time, okay? And so our rates of return are based off of documented data. We use a 5% rate of return in profits and a 6% rate of return on the land. And what do we find? We find that over this time period, again with our conservative estimate, that we would value that land loss at around $326 billion using our preferred specification, but depending on the specification, it could be anywhere from $265 billion to $359 billion. And that's a lot. I think at the time that we published the article, that was the market capitalization of Target and I can't remember, two other companies combined, right? Like this is a significant amount. And again, we consider this to be a conservative value, right? We don't incorporate into this the amount that Black families could have reinvested in farmland, right? We don't incorporate the fact that the returns that we're using might be too low, right? And we also don't capture all of the returns to that land. More education for their children, greater political activism, more control of labor in their free time, greater investments in the future, right? All of these things. And so, when you think about it, when you start that multiplier effect, right, the loss of this land was much larger than what I've demonstrated today. And so to conclude, I want to connect it to the launch of the Burnham-Nobles Digital Archive. I think that really represents an opportunity to advance this work even further by helping to identify incidences of land loss that may have been directly and indirectly related to specific and identifiable acts of racial violence, right? That the records in this archive are digitized and made publicly accessible is a true public service that I hope researchers, teachers, genealogists, and everyday people make use of in order to affect this restorative change. Thank you.
All right. Professor Jackson So, joining us from the University of Richmond School of Law. Work pertains to the role of law enforcement officers under the prism of a racialized social contract. Provides insights on leveraging contract doctrine and conceptualized remediation for racial injustices. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. All right, so I will just quickly join the chorus of people saying how deeply honored they are. I did not imagine that I would, have a chance to do this, certainly not like 9 weeks after giving birth. And I'm just really honored to be here. And I hope that this presentation will give some context on forward-looking paths towards more justice. All right, so the work that I'm trying to contextualize for us here is based in a theory that I call whiteness as contract. So those of us who are lawyers might be familiar with whiteness as property by a scholar named Cheryl Harris, and then also a theory of the racial contract by philosopher Charles Mills. What I've tried to do is not collapse those, but build those together, weave those together to create something that I call whiteness as contract. And I think that what I'm trying to do is use contract theory to articulate ways that we can make claims, be it in court, be it in TRCs, in any other forum necessary to make claims for justice and sort of conceptualize how what reparatory justice might look like. why do I put this quote here? Because we're talking about law enforcement here, and in this particular presentation, I'll talk about the physical violence done by law enforcement officers. There are definitely other conversations that could be had about other ways that law enforcement officers do their jobs in ways that harm us and do not do their jobs, right, in ways that harm us. But today I'm going to talk about the physical violence. And we've been talking a lot about terrorism today. And so what we're talking about is, well, you know, does racism matter? Is racism still an issue? What's the big deal about race? Outside of this room, where everyone is very acutely aware of the importance of race, you hear those questions a lot. And so I really wanted to recall this quote by Stokely Carmichael that says, well, it's really not about how you feel about my skin color or how you feel about my ethnic heritage. It's about the power that you have to snuff out my life or to have a material impact on my life. So what I used to have before I realized it was too triggering would be like a picture of Derek Chauvin, right, killing George Floyd, which, you know, we've just heard this wonderful panel before ours telling moving stories about the continued impact of lynchings. And then we heard, you know, from our anthropological expert, right, about, you know, what it means to talk about things as if they are in the past, when these lynchings are happening very much, you know, today. And we never know when they will happen in the future, but we do know, unfortunately, that they are likely to continue to happen. So what we have is the formal, on the one hand, there's a formal law that says we are all equal under the law, right? We all know that here in the United States, we are all equal under the law. We all have equal rights. That's the formal rule. However, there is what I like to call a tacit, invisible common law. And with respect to law enforcement, what that means is a relationship that Monica Bell, she's a scholar at Yale, calls legal estrangement. So there's what police are supposed to do to and for and by you. And then there's the Black experience with the law enforcement, which is an experience that is estranged from what is what is formally promised us, right? So we know we are underserved, we're over-surveyed, we're cheated, we're lied to. I've sat on grand juries before where, you know, you'll have the same police officer coming out claiming that he was on 147th and 7th at the same time that he had said he was at Union Square for a different indictment, right? And in, you know, in Manhattan, when I was doing this work, the expectation was that you would always get a bill of indictment, right? The lying is just a matter of course, right? So all those things happen and we are impacted by them, despite the fact that we're all equal under the law, right? Okay, so then there's the question of the polis, we the people, and the police. Of course, we know that the police are meant to protect and serve us, but as I've just tried to articulate, that mandate never seems to really work out. It doesn't seem to quite be applicable to people of African descent in the US, notwithstanding formal provisions of law. So the question then is, what is it that police are actually protecting, and who are they serving? And that's where whiteness as contract comes in. According to my theory, right, police are actually trying to enforce, protect property, and they're trying to enforce what is actually a social contract, right, that says, yes, you are all equal under the law, parenthetical, if you're white. And if you are Black, you are, as an asterisk to that, a threat to that social contract. You are a threat to that social fabric. So if U.S. citizenship is, and we've talked about the importance of land to citizenship, and how as soon as people became emancipated from slavery, they wanted to get their hands on land because we know almost intrinsically as Americans that our stake in this country is based on property ownership, right? Our taxes, right? Our schools are funded based on property taxes. Everything is about property. And so if you are a police officer and you owe something to we the people, right, which is we the parenthetical white people, then you've got to keep the asterisks and the people in the parentheses out of that project, right? You got to make sure that they can't get the land and that they can't even be able to contract for it on equal terms. And so maybe when they say protect and serve, they're not lying. We just don't hear what they're actually saying. Right? So, right, as someone who teaches contracts, and who also sometimes teaches property, right? I understand that there are two forms of contractorship and proprietorship. There's the commercial, right? The ability to get a loan, a home loan, the ability to negotiate one's salary at work, the ability to, buy something at Macy's, right? But there's also a political and social element of this. There's what I call like a social proprietorship, the ability to simply be present in a space, any space, without being harassed or having some kind of human rights violation be executed upon your body, right? There is also political proprietorship, the right to cast a vote. And in that casting of the vote, you are contracting with the state. You're negotiating with the state for an outcome. So you see, at every level, there's commercial contractorship and proprietorship, and there's social, economic, cultural contractorship and proprietorship. And I'm making the case that police have existed and continue to exist in this country to keep people of African descent from executing either kind of proprietorship or contracting authority. Does that make sense? Is it too depressing? I'm sorry. As a contract professor, I will teach out of something that's called the Uniform Commercial Code. And we teach Article 2, we teach Article 9. And we sort of all take it for granted that in Article 9 we talk about, right, secure transactions. But if you look very closely between the fine lines, you'll see that sheriffs, right, can actually execute, right, or secure, they can deliver warrants against property that's supposed to be secured. The Universal Commercial Code was written well after slavery was formally ended. However, what is something that sheriffs used to do, that the police in their earliest iterations used to do, they would chase after property that was secured and bonded and bring it back to their owners if they weren't shot or lynched first, right? So you see, all along history, we have this history, right, of sheriffs as people who are encouraged and mandated even to secure an understanding for white people that they will maintain control, total control over property, even when that property is human, okay? And I apologize for my lack of articulation. I am just exhausted and yeah.
You're way more fine.
Here's a case study. Here's a case study. The most honorable Patricia Williams is in the room with us today. And in her famous book that sent me to law school, Alchemy of Race and Rights, she talks about the Eleanor Bumpurs case, which is this horrific case of a disabled and elderly African-American woman living in New York City in 1984 who lived in public housing and she owed what was the equivalent of 1 month's back rent. And the powers that be decided to evict her out of 1 month of back rent. Now, apparently members of her family had actually gone down to the rent office and tried to pay for that 1 month, which was something less than $100, if I'm not mistaken. But because they didn't have the exact amount, they refused to take any of it and decided to evict her instead. So, this is Mrs. Bumpurs, again, elderly. She lived with a disability, including some mental wellness issues. And police officers came to evict her, and she was terrified. She put up a sort of a fight, like a physical fight. And I think it was also said that she thought that she was seeing Ronald Reagan coming up through the walls, or she was sort of hallucinating. They shot her once and shot off her entire hand. They could have really stopped there, and that would have already been too atrocious. But they shot her twice and killed her. And for me, that is a most tragic but compelling example of everything I've just been trying to share with you about how whiteness and contracting and law enforcement come together to literally squeeze the life out of us. It wasn't enough that she was poor. It wasn't enough that she was disabled, right? Over 1 month, right, of rent, they said, nope, you breached your contract and therefore you deserve to be homeless. And not only that, because you dared to put up a fight, you are now deceased, right? And that was a year before I was born. So again, not so far in the past at all. Okay, I'm coming to the end of the presentation. What do we do with all of this, okay? How can we use this depressing little theory of contract to get us to something that might look like hope? When you take a contracts course, certainly if you take one with me, you will learn that if you make a misrepresentation in a contracts negotiation and the other party finds out that you have been engaging in fraud, that contract is voidable. What does that mean for what we've been talking about? Well, if we've all been promised that we're equal under the law, and if we've all been promised that the police are there to protect and serve us, i.e. not abuse us, not cheat us, not lie to us, not wrongfully arrest us or beat us or kill us, then perhaps the social contract that is in place, even though I'm telling you that we are in parentheticals and we don't belong, the fact is that the state has been telling us that we belong, and if we're just a little more polite, if we're just a little more compliant, we'll be fine. So do we not have a voidable contract? Should we not just say, actually, this is fraud? Right? You have been defrauding us. I would say that maybe that is a framework that we might be able to use in making claims for reparatory justice, right? And then there's also the theory of reliance. The theory of reliance under contract law says that if you have relied in a way that is reasonable on someone's promises to your own detriment, that the other party is stopped. They're forbidden from delivering what they said they were going to promise to you. So if you tell me that the police exist to protect me, and I rely on you insofar as I, as a resident of a municipality, give over my tax money so that you can be paid your salary as a law enforcement officer, you should be stopped from not making good on your promise to me. And if you have not made good on your promise to me, even though I've reasonably relied on you, then there should be economic damages. There should be damages that should be awarded to me in court. Okay? So that is another framework that I think we could use, another hook we could use if we were to be in a court of law or some other tribunal setting. As far as standing goes, right? If you go to court, you have to be someone who has been harmed in order to claim a remedy. I argue that anybody who pays taxes, any kind of tax, right? Income tax, sales tax, right? While I don't think that should necessarily be a requirement, certainly if you do pay taxes, you should be found to have standing to make these claims for reparatory justice. And then, and just in conclusion, I'll say, I'm a little bit less interested personally in trying to attach an exact dollar amount, because like someone said earlier here today, can you unburn me, right? Can you unkill me? Even if you could, the fact is I suffered pain while you were burning me the first time or killing me the first time. So I'm not sure we can ever find a value that accounts for the level of injustice that is being done. But what I do think we can do is use some of these frameworks based on contract law as a way to advocate for structural redistributions. Someone said they don't think we should have student loan debt. I'm not sure we should pay taxes. That's just me. But I got a crazy looking tax bill, so I might just be mad. I'm not sure that we should have to pay down payments on housing, right? There should be programs that exist, or there could be programs, in the theory that could exist, where we get free housing, or we're able to buy homes without a down payment, and caps on how much we can pay on a monthly mortgage. I mean, really you can get creative, but we first have to get there to some kind of form with some kind of theory upon which we can articulate our claims. And so I hope that this has been helpful and maybe getting us just a little further down the road and thinking about how we might chart a path forward. Thank you all so much, and I hope you guys have a great rest of the afternoon.